Lovely. Thank you very much, Suzanne, and welcome along. Whether you have any proficiency in numismatics and coins at all, or whether you're hoping to learn, the golden ticket, so to speak, about numismatics and potentially putting eggs in two baskets, both from a stamp perspective and a coin perspective, hopefully this talk will be of some use to you. You will often hear coins talked about as the Collectable of Kings. I think arguably also stamps could probably claim that title courtesy of the Royal Philatelic Collection, of which we're very proud to be affiliated, of course, at Spink. But when it comes to coins, of course, that was Spink's first home as a numismatist, going all the way back as a numismatic specialist to at least 1818, when we're recorded as our first Spink agents bidding at a coin auction at Christie's and Sotheby's at the time in 1818. But I thought what would be useful, preaching to an unconverted choir, so to speak, would be to take a run through of what is that exactly that makes coins collectible. What are the differences against the stamp world? What is it to look out for? What is it that we in the coin world have lucky? And what is it we could be doing differently? So it's pretty much a rundown. So Suzanne, if you're able to help me with the slides, let's move on to what is it that actually makes a coin collectible. And this is there's an obvious one, of course, which is the conditional quality. In the same way that stamps you're looking for new, unused, with coins you're trying to look for as good as possible. Every collector out there prides themselves on getting the best in class when it comes to condition, and coins is no exception. Of course, like with banknotes and with stamps, you can't tamper with these things. You can't clean them to improve them. You can't do things that adulterate the surfaces or quality of them, because that will negatively impact said item. But the conditional quality is really important. And of course, there are two stages to coin production. There is either the handmade coinage, which is the very early stuff, which I'll touch upon throughout the talk. And there is, of course, the milled coinage, which is the stuff that is steam and machine pressed. And of course, although many of us don't carry coins in our pockets these days, is the stuff that we're used to in our daily lives up until at least recently. So coins have, by their very nature, an intrinsic value to them. When we're talking about gold sovereigns, when we're talking about silver currency, whether you are based in the UK or whether you're looking at gold francs, gold eagles in America, gold marks in Germany, and further afield, nuggets, maples, all over the world, gold is a valued asset, and the fact that it has been turned into coinage makes coins collectible by that very metric of having a metal value to them. Gold and silver, pound, shillings, and pence, of course, based on weights and standards, the very metric by which money was valued was by its intrinsic content. And so as collectors today, we have the benefit, unlike with stamps, of course, paper and watermarked paper doesn't have an intrinsic value per se, but gold coins do. And so with the price of gold and the doom and gloom in the world, we, of course, have that benefit just on a purely metal value. We also have historical cultural significance and or resonance. By that, I mean something that you may be thinking in the stamp world. Of course, the 6th of May, 1840 is a very important date within the life of the stamp collecting world. In coins, we don't benefit from having a particular date or time. We have to affiliate with a year of issue. We also have to sometimes affiliate with a month of issue when we're talking about some of the wars and the emergency currency that comes out. And so from that point of view, what we mean by historical and cultural significance are things that we can tie to specific events in time, or as close to. So whether that comes to hoards, which I'll touch on in a bit, or whether that comes to a specific issue that then becomes an economic failure, these are things that we can look for when it comes to collectible coins, and things that have a charged emotion, whether that's to us today and through our modern lens, or whether that's through an historic lens as a traditional item. And that feeds very much into another item, which is the trophy status. In the stamp world, it's very familiar. You want the best in class, you want the most famous. Examples, of course, the inverted Jenny is a classic example of a trophy stamp, and you have the same things when it comes to coins. You want the biggest denomination, you want the best denomination. Sometimes you want the oldest, sometimes you want the last. And of course, with the passing of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, the last issues we're starting to see become a collectible category. We're starting to see people speculate around that time as well about the Platinum Jubilee, the last issues of Queen Elizabeth. All of that is feeding into a narrative which is the diet of the traditional coin collector. What is it that's collectible? And And of course, what feeds that is, of course, rarity. If something has an unending issue, is something that has no limited edition nature to it, then of course that negatively impacts the value. Whereas something that has a very limited run, or something that just doesn't survive, that all contributes to both the historical significance, but also the trophy status aspect of an item. Unlike with stamps, where manufacturing errors, print errors are a very sought after category, and I have had many a talk with Tom and Josh about watermark errors, color trial errors, things of that nature. In coins, it's less so much. We have started to see, very much coming from the American market, an interest in manufacturing errors, things where a coin is struck from the wrong metal, or coins where they're struck completely with the wrong dies. That is starting to become a more popular category, but is something that I will touch upon in a bit more detail as we go through the slides. Another one, of course, is provenance. Just like with the stamp world, we are very lucky in coins to have 200 or 300 years worth of historical records, and at Spink we have a phenomenal numismatic library going back to the 1820s, which have notes in it that tell us exclusive details about who was buying, what they were buying, the prices they were buying them for. And of course, if we can tie that to something we're selling today, that adds a huge amount of value to it, both the context of the item, but what we like to call the second life and the provenance of it. Where has this item been since it was produced and who has owned it? Because that ultimately tells you back to the other points about conditional quality and trophy status. If this item has been treasured by the best names of the last 200 years, then of course you want it today as a collector. Then we have some slightly more esoteric or quirky things that come in with coins. And so we obviously benefit. Of course, we've all seen news stories, the clickbait articles you see online when it's talking about hoards that have been recovered by lucky metal detectorists, or shipwreck finds from a sunken Spanish treasure. These things are very particular to the coin world, and there is a lot of interest when it comes to these things. Whenever there is a hoard sale or a shipwreck sale, you often get to translate that into a much wider community far beyond coins. So it's another benefit that we have, which is, of course, appealing to a traditional collector base, but in these particular instances, you have a much bigger fanfare because people love to have a piece of history, and that cuts through like no other category of numismatics when you have a sale of that nature. And the final one, which is very much emerging in recent years, is the who made it class. And what by that I mean is who was involved in the production, who were these people, and this is all to do with the who do you think you are effect. Whereas the fact that we have now Find My Past, Ancestry, we have a lot of additional research tools that are now digitized and online, whether you've been to the National Archives or not. There are so many different angles by which you can now investigate the background of a coin and tally it to a piece of history going back to the trophy status or the cultural significance, that now means as who made it now becomes important. And as you'll see later on in my talk, some of those people are quite recognizable faces. So courtesy of Suzanne, we'll just sort of go into a bit more detail about what do we mean by conditional quality. Now, you may be very familiar in the philatelic world with expressions like fine, very fine, extremely fine, and of course uncirculated, the dream scenario. And that very much within the traditional Western world, within coin collecting, England, America, was very much the go-to force and has been for the last 200 years. But it's fair to say in the last 20, 30 years, there has been the inception of a new category of grading, which is based on companies that have set themselves up traditionally in America, but there are some other companies in the Far East now as well, that very much pride themselves on being able to authenticate the items they're handling, much in the same way that you might go to a governing body in the philatelic world to get a certification, but also giving their own grading assessment. And the ultimate aim of this is to try and give grading on a numerical scale rather than an English language fine, very fine, extremely fine scale, in order to get more people involved in it to make the item more of an asset than necessarily a collectible coin. Now, purists amongst us will decry the fact that it's becoming more like a trading platform in that sort of sense, but it's fair to say that within the numismatic world, unlike in the stamp world, which has resisted quite heavily to this in recent years, the grading game is now a big part of the international sale of coins. And so you will often see Spink standard catalogues being supported by or bolstered by third-party companies. And of course, in Spink and our London offices, we have a third-party company one of their outposts is based here. So if you can't beat them, join them is very much the feeling and sentiment of that within numismatics. And we can definitely see the benefits of this because grading is now, in theory, standardized and it's transparent. So as a new collector, someone that's just getting into the field, someone that doesn't necessarily have the ins and outs knowledge that 20, 30, 40, 50 years of trading and dealing and handling these things has, they are able to trust and place trust in an item that is hermetically sealed, that gives them a guarantee of authenticity and, in theory, a guarantee of quality. But of course, the downside with that is, of course, as every grading company has experienced, it is still highly subjective. You know, putting a numerical grade on something isn't exactly the same as a specialist at an auction house or a private dealer putting an extremely fine grade on a coin that they trade over the counter. And so it is still a highly subjective field. And as we have often seen, coins can be submitted several times and have several different grades. And going back to the point on conditional quality, you shouldn't be able to clean or change the surfaces of a coin to improve its value. But in some cases, you do get that with services that they offer. And so it's worth bearing in mind that whilst we in the coin world adore patina, cabinet tone, things that show the age and authenticity of an item, today there are people that are trying to use that particular platform in order to improve and augment and resell items and flip them, as is the colloquial expression, in short-term turnaround times. And so there is a cautionary note with this new grading scale, which is that it still remains surprisingly subjective. And there are benefits, of course. There are coins that have previously been condemned as false that are now given the authentic guarantee, but also, simultaneously, coins that were once considered genuine that are now considered false as a result of this process. And so authentication is but a new standard within a much broader field within coin collecting. And whilst, of course, you can still sell coins without third-party authentication, as many auction houses do, it's important to remember that people sometimes are buying them purely to speculate on this. So it's worth bearing that in mind when it comes to condition. And so moving to intrinsic value, when you look at, as I said before, what it was that made people interested in coins in the first place, it's a very simple metric. When you have a gold coin, the bigger the denomination, the bigger the intrinsic value. That is a naturally prized commodity throughout human history, going back to the very first coins in the 6th century BC in Lydia in Asia Minor. Coins had an intrinsic content to them, and that is the nature by which people still collect them to this day. Because if you have 2,500 years of background history behind the coin, and even 100 years of background history behind the coin, people value gold. And of course, as we have seen, unfortunately, with the events in Europe and in the Middle East, gold coins have surged in value purely by dint of the intrinsic content of them. And so because we have sovereigns that are a traditional staple in the United Kingdom, francs in France, marks in Germany, and other very recognizable coins around the world, we are starting to see people value the intrinsic content of the coins just as much as the historic value of some of these coins. And so in instances we have seen in recent years, the collectible value overtaken by the pure intrinsic value and the price rise of metals. And what is interesting to note, and something that the Royal Mint has put out, a lot of data they've studied, is the way that multicultural shifts within collecting, particularly within the domestic market, but also internationally, is very much down to changes in and shifting sands within community demographics and the increased demand. Of course, if you have a background, whether you're from the Jewish community, whether you're from the Indian community and you celebrate Diwali, or whether you celebrate Chinese New Year, where there are traditional gifts of gold or traditional stores of wealth by having gold within that cultural psyche of yours, we're seeing that intermingling with people that are, of course, looking at what is happening in Europe with horror and thinking, maybe I should diversify my portfolio. And we're also seeing it very strongly with female collectors, which is something that is more unusual within the categories of coins and stamps, but is something that is coming with a degree of resurgence that is noticeable within data that the Royal Mint is putting out. And so it is very interesting to see that in times of doom and gloom, of course, people have gone to traditional safe havens like gold, but we're now starting to see that apply across the board, not just within those that are in the know, so to speak. And I think that's probably because aspects like the internet has definitely weaponized these search terms, weaponized these thought processes. And of course, it's the great leveler in the same way that we've seen prices be leveled and it become even more difficult to resell items because it's so easy to find the price attainment points at auction. We have also seen people start to focus in and zero in because meta tags are now using 5 guineas, £5 sovereigns that make it so much easier as a collector to just focus on things. And so whilst the traditional collecting model has evolved rapidly in the last 20 years, and I'm sure it will again in another 20, you're starting to see people focus on that purely by benefit of having technological exposure, and also being more in tune with what is going on in the world. And of course, the final benefits from a purely taxation point of view, and of course, I must stress that I'm not accredited to provide financial advice, but certainly it's worth bearing in mind, is that there's huge tax benefits to having investment gold and CGT exempt coins. And so one of the big things that's very popular is buying sovereigns and Britannias, the gold 1 ounce coins, because of course, if you don't have to pay VAT or have to worry about the resale taxation from a capital gains point of view, that's a hugely popular thing for people to be able to look after their money. And so from that point of view, whilst post-1800 coins benefit from this and pre-1800 don't, still a lot of collectors are looking at that and thinking, this is a good thing to put some of my assets into. So now we've talked about the modern aspects of coin collecting, we should move to historical significance. And of course, in the same way that stamps you can very easily prioritize based on their time of issue, of course, since May 1840, with most coins, you can almost date any coin that comes after 1600, because certainly across Europe, across the New World and the Old, since about 1600, most coins carry a date. And that in and of itself is a draw, like a moth to a flame, for coin collectors, because of course the traditional collecting model is to scratch the itch of completing a date run. In the same way that you fill up every space in your scholarly stamp albums, you want to do the same with coins. You want to be able to say, I'm collecting shillings, pounds, half crowns, whatever it may be. I want to be able to collect every available date. And by dint purely of having a date of issue on them, even if the design is exactly the same, people traditionally have collected an entire date run. And so we have whole sales of half crowns or shillings of an entire date run. And obviously, in the same way, like with the addition of plate numbers in the Victorian period on penny reds, we have the same thing about the same time with Victorian shillings, Victorian sixpences. And so there is an additional niche category for some collectors, and a collection we're handling at the moment, where people have collected not just on the date, but the specific die number. And so you end up with enormous collections of the same date, but 120 different die numbers, if you're so passionate to do that. And so there are people that, just from a historical significance point of view, like to be the completists. And that very much is what's feeding into the mindset of being a collector. But those with deeper pockets, they will always try to seek out the things with wider cultural resonance. And by that, I mean, we're looking at the artistic revivals. So in the 1840s, with the rebuilding of the Houses of Parliament, there was a huge neo-Gothic revival, championed by Pugin, of course, and that impacted the coinage. And so we have a fantastic coin of a young Queen Victoria in 1847 known as a Gothic crown, which has this neo-Gothic revival element to it. So she looks like a medieval princess on an 1840s coin. And I'm sure I've seen Gothic portraits on some of the stamp effigies at the time as well. And so you see that same impact in the philatelic world as you do in numismatics. But because it was a one-year type and only 8,000 were produced, that limited edition element to it, and also courtesy of the Victorians not being particularly good at keeping coins in good condition, those that are in very good condition are very well sought after. And the Gothic crown is just one of those examples of an artistic revival done as a moment of commemorative spirit that is very, very popular. Other elements are, of course, the trials and competitions. Trials and essays are a popular category in philately, very similarly so in coins, although by trials I'm looking more at things that did become coins, but these are in the production stages of it, or in particular cases, when we're talking about the 17th century, times where you have the personal trials done by famous medalists or die engravers who have failed to woo the king or sovereign at the time to adopt their currency designs or their platform. And so very famous examples of that happen in the time of the Commonwealth in the 1650s, and with Thomas Simon in 1663, and what is known as a petition crown, because he literally petitioned King Charles II unfortunately unsuccessfully, but ended up making a phenomenal series of coins that are now lauded amongst the numismatic community. And of course, within just general currency collecting, there are times of great national intrigue. So whilst there is sufficient quantities of currency existing from the First and Second World War, as an example of great national intrigue, there are other times when there aren't significant quantities of coins produced. Example of that would be around the time of the Spanish Armada. And so coins dating specifically to 1588 are very hotly contested, and there are very few of them around, and often they're found in very poor grade. And one particular example that we had is a wonderful example of Queen Elizabeth I standing in a ship that was dated to the year of the Spanish Armada. Now you can see all of the allegory that is put forward there. Of course, she was not a naval queen, but she is famous for staving off the Spanish Armada, or being at least the sovereign at the time. And so from a collector's point of view, that is like gold dust, literally and figuratively. And so from that point of view, a national intrigue element to the coin itself is greatly important. But within that, we're also looking at the modern coin sales, which is something that we all see now in the newspapers, online, through targeted media. And that is something that a lot of the third-party companies have aimed to target this strapline of the great national intrigue. We've seen it with, of course, the passing of the Queen, with the number of issues that came out, not just for her Platinum Jubilee, but the memorial issues and, of course, the first issues of King Charles III. And what is always cautionary to note is because these are being produced and marketed as commemoratives, they're likely to have poorer returns, because the more people that collect them as commemoratives, the more likely they are to keep them in perfect condition. So at the time of resale, there is no differentiation on the condition side of things. And unless there are sufficient demands for it in future, which, given the fickleness of the way that people collect these days, isn't guaranteed, they are more likely than not to have poorer returns. And so one must be conscious of that when they think about modern historical significance or potentially speculating. So moving on to trophy status, what is very interesting is something, as I was putting this together, is what do I mean by trophy status? Because for me, as a traditional coin specialist, someone who's been doing this for a decade or more, I've always thought about it as being the biggest denomination of its time, the finest craftsmanship of the most celebrated designers of history, and that long-held rarity that previous collectors have always benchmarked against. And felt like these are the coins that, if you had them, you really have the proverbial cherry on top of the cake. And so here are just sort of half a dozen examples of the famous ones. When we look at the Vigo 5 guineas of 1703, that has everything that I've talked about. Whether it's the cultural resonance, it's made by Sir Isaac Newton at the Royal Mint in 1703. It is made at a time when the British are fighting off the Spanish during the 18th century crisis wars between Louis of France and Queen Anne, and the Spanish at the same time. And so there's a bit of patriotic pride there. It's the 5 guineas. It's the biggest gold coin produced at the time. Its rarity, there are only 20 or so known. It ticks all of those boxes, and as a result, it's become this lauded 18th century coin, which the most recent example has sold for a record of 900,000, a dream kind of environment for a numismatic coin. I also briefly mentioned the petition and red-eye crowns of Thomas Simon of 1663. Again, these are something that have been identified since the mid-18th century as being the absolute collector's dream coin. The petition, the more famous brother of the red-eyes, which is more of a Latin slant on the same coin, but still with only 20 or 30 specimens in existence, some of which are, of course, impounded in museum collections. Today, you'd be looking at £750,000 for a really, really good example. And again, that's something that over many generations has been lauded as a trophy coin. Another one that's slightly more esoteric, but again has the background history, Thomas Rawlins' crown of 1644, which has a wonderful vista of Oxford during the English Civil War. Of course, a famous bastion of royal support during a time of great intrigue, and something that, based on the artistic merit and skill and its rarity, is something that today probably £300,000 would be needed to acquire it. But then we start getting back into the handmade coins. When we're looking at other trophy items, the Edward III double leopard is a very recent addition to the trophy status cabinet, because there is only one in private hands. The other two were found by 2 Newcastle schoolboys while searching in the River Tyne in the 1840s. So since the 1840s, collectors have dreamed of owning this, but it wasn't until 2006 when another example was found they could actually do it. But given the trophy status, that's something that is so rare it was unobtainable for almost 200 years. And finally, the Henry III gold penny, which is an example of a failed economic experiment by a king right at the time of his refounding of Westminster Abbey. And so I'm sure many of you will have seen the Cosmati pavement, the coronation pavement upon which King Charles and Queen Camilla sat only 2 years ago. And here we have an example of a coin which starts the story of coronations in the United Kingdom and is England's first gold coin. So from a strapline point of view, from a collectible point of view, one of only 8 coins in existence, you can see why people treasure it today. But continuing the theme of the trophy status, what we've also seen with the way that the modern market has changed, we have now started to see those as the traditional yesteryear trophies. So how the market has changed now is, again, directly as a result of third-party grading, and of course also the impact of the internet. And so what is so surprising, as I'm sure you'll see from the slide on the screen, is I have just rattled off half a dozen coins which are up to 1,000 years old, or the best part of 1,000 years old. And then you look at these coins and you think, well, hang on a minute, all of the examples you're seeing on screen are less than 200 years old. Why are these things attaining double or triple that, or even breaking the psychological £1 million barrier? And that is principally because the cultural resonance of these things, the collector appeal of their fact being only 1 or 2 examples in existence, and simply the fact that some people depicted on them, like with Edward VIII, just cuts through in a way that nothing else does in numismatics. I'm sure many of you will remember looking for a 1933 penny in your change, and that famously being something that culturally resonated far beyond the scope of a collector category. And of course, today, if you were able to own one, it would probably set you back £200,000 for something that's less than 100 years old. If you want to collect Edward VIII, you're now looking into serious sums of money. But what is the most remarkable in the collector category, and it's something that isn't that rare but has become artificially rare because of this internet craze, is the in the line £5. And what is so remarkable about this is until the 1980s, these things were not considered that collectible. You had to have one if you wanted to complete your denomination run of £5 pieces, but they weren't that highly prized. It was only with the writing of books in the Far East, the collector's appeal in America, that sort of looked at these and thought, well, 400 examples of this. It's quite rare, but it's not uber rare. But we can really make something out of this. And the marketing appeal of just this one coin has meant that, again, backed by the fact that it is gold, backed by the fact that it has an investment gold status, has meant people now seriously collect this. And so, in a strange way, the trophy coins that I have mentioned have evolved even within one generation. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves going forward as well. Moving on to manufacturing errors, which is more of a home turf, so to speak, of the philatelic world, we're also starting to see the evolution of manufacturing errors within the coin world being a serious collecting category. But it's fair to say they are definitely not as widely sought or particularly celebrated. And that's often because those we encounter are clearly made for what is known as mint sport. They are evidently done by idle hands at the mint at various times in history. And even with the improvements in quality control at the mint facilities, the limitations of how much can come in and out of the mint through unofficial channels, it's still lacking the significant uptick in collector categories within coins. But the most notable examples within this category are when coins are struck in the wrong metal, when they're struck with the wrong dies. People might remember the undated 2008 20p coin as an example of that. And also these very unusual coins called brockages, where you end up having a previous blank coin stuck to the die, striking and impressing an inverted design on the next blank that comes in. And so you end up with something that has literally 2 tails or 2 heads, one inverted and one in relief. And that is something that is very noticeable, very overt, but is entirely mechanical in design. And it's something that is collected because it's something that is unusual and should have not escaped quality control, but sometimes does. And in that particular instance, we currently hold the world record for a brockage coin, which is about £60,000. But the reason it was so expensive was because it came within a hoard of coins. And so the fact this thing had actually circulated, even without a king's head on it, was obviously something that was a source of desire in the 1720s when it was lost, so to speak. But it's something that is obviously very desirable today, and something that, again, when the marketing was done for that sale a couple of years ago, did cut through. And so it'll be interesting to see how manufacturing errors, whether manufactured or whether mechanical errors, will start to impact the collector's market, certainly within British coins, as it has been doing in American coins of late. And so that's going to be very interesting to see going forward how the coin market evolves there and potentially opportunities that come. Moving again to another traditional turf area of the philatelic world is provenance. In the same way that we celebrate and champion great names, Chartwell being an example of such, of the philatelic world, provenance is becoming a more important aspect of the collecting category within coins. And what we like to look at is the second life of these. Now, it's fair to say over the last 150 years, the interest in provenance has ebbed and flowed as people move from simply fixated upon reselling these items and not holding them for very long, to people that treasure the fact that they have these for effectively their entire lives as the true passionate collectors that we all know and love. And it's fair to say that at the moment, given the fact that the scourge of counterfeiting is so high in order, given the not necessarily full support of third-party grading companies in some sectors, people are looking at provenance as the ultimate deterrent against counterfeiting, but the ultimate proof of value with their items. And what is so fascinating that we have seen in our recent sales and testifies very often is it can be the key differentiator when it comes to someone wanting to purchase a coin at auction. Now, some coins are exceedingly common, but it can be the case that because something has a provenance with it that is named to the most famous collector of their period or their time, that literally double or quadruple the value can be tendered simply because of that association. And of course, when we're talking about provenance, it's not loosely ascribed. It's not in the case of the art world where it might be the school of or believed to be or attributed to. In provenance terms, we are talking true attributions. And of course, because we have a fantastic numismatic library going back 200 years, we have a benefit at Spink that we can look and test exactly what we claim to be true or not. And of course, in many instances, we do remove pedigree that has been confounded or confused, and we also add pedigree that has been lost and forgotten. And so that is an important part of the coin collecting world, as it is in stamps, but it is something that very much is worth looking out for, because of course, for the collector of tomorrow, you want to have bought the same coins that the collector of yesterday had. And so from that point of view, if you can generate the best collection in class, you're going to want to use things that have already been tried and tested in the market. And as a result, that gives us that unique edge still within the numismatic world that means that people are still coming to us with their grandfathers, their fathers, their uncles, their aunts' collections from 50 years ago because of the coin tickets. But of course, they know that we celebrate not just the item that we're selling for a record price, but also the history behind it, the story that comes with it. And that's something that is key to the value and is something that is wonderfully rewarding in the field of numismatics.
There are more Virtual Stampex talks coming to YouTube. Subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss out.
Moving on to, of course, the complete red herring category, which is something that would be rather unfamiliar to philately, is the random discoveries, the hoards and shipwrecks aspect of the coin world. And this is something that, again, captivates the attention of people far beyond the category of coins and the collectibles category in general, because, of course, everyone wants to dream of finding buried treasure. They want to dream of being able to see a shipwreck of silver 8 reals or doubloons coming from the murky depths. And so that really translates, and that allure translates to a market value. And so, unlike all the other things I've mentioned today, hoards and shipwrecks buck the trend when it comes to condition. There doesn't seem to be as much interest in the condition of these things because people are accepting of the fact that they've been underground, they might have been turned over by plough soil, or they might, of course, have been corroded by sea salt. And so from that point of view, people aren't collecting these on the basis of the same norms they would other coins, but they are doing it because they want a literal piece of history. And so one great example of that is the Area Hoard, which had the brockagen that I've already mentioned, but that sold against estimate 300 times, 300% overestimate. And that was very poorly represented in terms of general quality of coins, but simply because you could attribute a story to the coin, going back to that provenance, but also because you could say that it had come from a hoard that hadn't been seen for 292 years. Immediately people were captivated by that. And by people, I mean collectors, new and old, as well as people that were never going to buy another coin, They just loved this story and they wanted a piece of it. And it's exactly the same when you come to Spanish shipwrecks from the 1715 plate fleet that sunk off the coast of Florida Keys, or the Hollandia that sunk off the English coast and was salvaged in the 1970s. Even now, 20, 30, 40 years after those sales have happened, they still captivate people and people still want to own a piece of shipwreck or hoard history. And that provenance alone can add value. And then we come to our final category before I open it up to questions, which we'll have 5 or so minutes to do, is the who made it category. And this is very much the unknown category and something that I'll be looking to see as time progresses in future. And it's something that the numismatic world is slowly waking up to. And it's something that the medal world has very much been pointing us in the direction of, given the fact that we now have ancestral accounts like Find My Past, Ancestry, and other research databases, that people are now starting to broaden their research opportunities, and as a result, they're starting to collect things they otherwise wouldn't collect, but now do because they appreciate the context in which the item was struck or produced. And so not many people will know, but Sir Isaac Newton, of Gravity fame, was actually Master of the Mint for over 20 years and is instrumental in the production of standardized currency in the 17th and early 18th century in Britain. And we have him to thank for a standard metric system that ensured that Britain did not go bankrupt at the time of the South Sea Company bubble. Even if he personally lost money in it, he made sure that the British economy survived and endured. And so the fact that you can actually own something that would have been handled, touched, engaged with, and made standard by Sir Isaac Newton appeals to a lot of people, and we have collectors that specifically collect that period because of that. Another example that might be less famous or brand recognition worth, but William Wellesley Pole, who was of course the brother of the Duke of Wellington. He was Master of the Mint in the 1810s and 1820s, and his coinage is signed WWP, which makes it rather easy to spot. But he is instrumental in bringing in some of the greatest architecture of coin design in British history. Benedetto Pistrucci, a flamboyant Italian, and the Wyan family, who he went toe-to-toe with on many an occasion, because he refused to use artists' works like Sir Francis Chantrey at the beginning of the Royal Academy. This is the time of the renaissance of British coin design, when you have people really passionate about bringing the neoclassical and the neo-Gothic elements in, but also championing and celebrating the imperial legacy of Britain at a time when Britain was very much looking outwards, whereas potentially today it might be looking more inwards. And so you see that bleeding into coin design at the time, and that is something that is becoming very, very popular, and again, bucking the trend. Whereas some museums and some institutions are seeking to shirk or hide parts of their history they're not so proud of, coin collectors, by and large, are very interested in collecting the less savoury parts of coin collecting, and that is something that we hope to see continue going forward. We are definitely seeing a new generation of collectors come through, and a lot of them are inspired by the fact that they can effectively guarantee the authenticity of the object that they are buying in this plastic encapsulation, rather than having to have a full house library of reference works, or rather than having to have studied at university for a decade or more, or handled in trade for a decade or more, examples in the flesh to know what is good and what is bad. And so in essence, you are, in the same way that the art world uses catalogue raisonnés to effectively centralize what is and isn't an authentic product, to an extent the coin market is allowing the subjective opinion of authenticity or condition to be ceded to fewer and fewer people. And that is always a danger, particularly when there are so many people passionate about it. But of course, as I mentioned, the upside of that is it's meaning that more and more people who would not ordinarily engage with this are looking at this and going, this is an asset class I'm intrigued by. And it's very easy once you buy one thing to become fascinated by it, because history is always going to be that subject that no matter who you meet and no matter at what walk of life you come, they always say, I wish I got into that when I was younger. And what we're discovering with grading is people are actually doing that. They're engaging with that at a young age. And, you know, the fact that Spink testifies having so many specialists under the age of 30 in their early 30s,
yeah,
that exact principle. And we live by that standard, and that's fantastic.
Great. So another question is, what are your thoughts on crypto stamps, NFT twins? And it makes reference to, I think Spink had sold a coin NFT a few years ago. So just generally, what, because that's another area that we're always told is, you know, young people will collect if it's more digital or there's more kind of Bitcoin connection. So what's your views on that?
Well, what I can say from experience is the Bitcoin craze and NFT craze of 2021, 2022 may to an extent have subsided. And I think obviously we still hear the price of Bitcoin breaking the $100,000 barrier in the background. But certainly NFTs have cooled off quite considerably. Having handled the sale of the first international coin NFT, what was very interesting is the engagement from that community was entirely focused on the NFT. There wasn't any engagement from then into the numismatic world. However, when it came to Bitcoin, what was very interesting, very much in 2021, early 2022, and I engaged quite a few clients in this, is a lot of them were looking at the price of a Bitcoin when it was 65,000, excuse me, dollars each. They were saying, well, I can't, why is this digital manufacture thing worth that amount, but a coin of the 16th century worth a fraction of that? And so we started to see collectors actually go, okay, I'm making a considered opinion, but I'm going to invest in that because it's considered undervalued in my mind compared to other things. And so it was interesting to see how the digital world actually looked at the traditional collectors world and thought, this is undervalued, I'm going to put my money into it. But it's fair to say that at the moment they seem to be very much on parallel lines rather than diverging again, because I think people... I think the one traditional aspect of collectibles that will hold it back to those collectors is going to be the fact that people like the fact there's time and space to consider the item, and the whole love of it is owning it and spending time with it. Whereas when it comes to cryptocurrencies and NFTs, to an extent, yes, there's the reward in buying that item or securing that item. Everyone gets that trigger when they buy something at auction. There isn't the same love when it comes to it because it's not physical. It's a virtual thing. The actual the buzz that you feel of owning it is very different when you physically handle something because it's tangible and something that is digital. And so unless we as specialists, we should try and champion those people to convert them over into traditional collectors, like the Royal Mint has done with and of course the Royal Mail have done with modern stamps to try and convert people into traditional collectors. It's another avenue to do that. And I think there's definitely opportunities going forward with both to explore further. But at the moment, it's very much you feel like you're in one camp or the other. Either you're a purist or you're a digital specialist, but not both. But I think, yeah, there's definitely room for exploration there, but we shall see.
Do coin collectors exhibit? I guess that's meaning similar to a philatelic exhibition where there's frames and certain numbers of pages and judging and medals and point scoring. Does that happen in coins, and how does that work?
So the simple answer is not to my knowledge. The strange thing about coin collectors is by and large they tend to be very private people. You do get it a lot in the medal world. People love to exhibit the medal groups that they have because they're proud to be a part of the story of such and such an individual. With the coin world, unusually, even if you have the most famous example of something, you don't tend to exhibit it. There are a couple of exceptions to that. So Jeffrey Cope, who sold his collection in Switzerland last year, he proudly exhibited at the American Numismatic Association in 2007. And the Tyrant Collector, one of the biggest private collectors of coins out in America, he proudly exhibits at every numismatic convention show. I think it's purely on the logistical side. Yes, there are trade bodies and trade organizations that want people to exhibit and want people to turn up in the same way that Stampex does, or some of the prestigious royal shows that happen across the world. But the coin world, for whatever reason, it's always had that slight disconnect. And I don't know whether it's fears over the value, because you have the problems when it comes to insurance with stamps. But for whatever reason, people seem to be much more private about it. And they almost consider the ownership of it a private domain rather than the public domain, which is a shame. Because, of course, we have a wonderful showroom where we love to exhibit things in the advance of a sale or because an anniversary is coming up, but trying to cajole or persuade collectors into actually exhibiting, very much more difficult. So if you're going to collect coins and you want to exhibit them, you'd be in a minority, but we would absolutely welcome that because I think it would be a fantastic addition to the coin world.
Two questions on a similar theme. One is, what can philatelists learn from coins, if anything? And then secondly, can slabbing add anything to stamps?
What can philatelists learn from the coin world? That is a very good question. I think that the principle would be what stamps have struggled with since the advent of email in the sense the death knell of traditional post, is something that obviously the coin world is now facing, because it's looking at coins becoming extinct in favor of cashless payments. Now, we have thus far precariously navigated that balance with third-party grading, so maybe that is an answer to it. But of course, stamps has a much longer history when it comes to as an asset class, and of course, many a famous pension fund has gone bust trying to manipulate the stamp market. We're all aware of that. So maybe that's not necessarily the traditional route, but very much looking at the objects, trying to build up their resonance outside of the traditional field. And we're all guilty of it as collectors and specialists. We talk to each other. We're already the converted choir. What we need to do is find a way, whether that's coins, stamps, medals, banknotes, whatever it is, find the unique qualities that make these objects interesting. What is it that inspires us to be interested by them? And how can we project that onto others? Because, as I say, history is a natural basis by which everyone can be interested. And it's infectious. If you have a genuine passion for something and you want to share it, people will fall in line and love that. And so I think what you need to do is find the way to communicate that. And the fact that you have the lead on exhibitions, you're already communicating it. It's how do you get that to a wider audience to inspire people to collect? Because I have watched many a historic philatelic documentary, and what I found fascinating was, of course, the immediate post-war period for boys and girls who had just heard about father, mother who'd served in the Second World War and maybe have served overseas in some far-flung country. And of course, at the time when the empire is shrinking and colonies are becoming part of the British Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth era had begun, people wanted to make sense of the crazy world in which they lived, but they couldn't necessarily travel to it. So they used stamps to itemize that. And so what Stanley Gibbons did so successfully in the 50s and 60s inspired a whole generation of collectors purely by going, what is it that we as humans love doing, putting order to chaos? That is what you need to find. It's that little gold dust that whichever angle you do it from, whether it's, the first day of issue items, whether it's the penny black, which has a huge cultural resonance even today, finding a method by which you can inspire new generations of people to collect. It is actually easier said than done, but it is something that is the obvious clue for us all.
Yeah, great. One more question.
Sure.
Do you have a metal detector? Is the question.
So before I joined Spink, I did go metal detecting, and I still do have one that I use for my local history society. It is something that was a natural gateway for me to come into the coin world, because I started as a strapping young 15-year-old interested in history, but not really knowing how to apply it. So having done my GCSEs and A-levels, I then went out into metal detecting. Of course, being bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I was able to convince landowners to go and give me permission to go and dig up their land. And for me, it's fascinating, the fact that you can hold something that literally has been untouched for hundreds of years. I think that's really cool, and that's something that the coin world is very lucky to have. We are very lucky in the United Kingdom, as many parts of Europe are, to have such history literally beneath our feet. And that's somewhere where the coin world just has that resonance and that lucky nature to it. Buried treasure is something that appeals to everyone. And whether it's something that may only be worth mere pennies or something that may actually change the course of history, it's just infectious. And so I'm lucky to have had that gateway. I always say do it responsibly, because there are, of course, many clubs and societies now that do it almost as a business, which I think is a shame, because we shouldn't be stripping history. We should be understanding it responsibly. But again, it is something that is feeding a market, and it's now a big market. It's multi-million pounds a year now of things that are found and sold or go into museums. It's quite extraordinary.
There are more Virtual Stampex talks coming to YouTube. You know what to do. Click subscribe now so you don't miss out. See you soon. We hope to see you at our next Stampex show, at Virtual Stampex or in person in London.